If you look up Battle of Tours, Poitiers, 732 in Western books or on the internet, you'll very quickly run into claims like the battle that saved Europe from Islam, Charles Martel, the man who stopped the Arab invasion. At first glance, it sounds dramatic. On one side, the Umayyad Caliphate expanding like a storm from Arabia across North Africa and into Spain. On the other side, the Franks, ancestors of the French, led by a man with the nickname the Hammer, Charles Martel. Countless later stories, movies, and speeches have retold the Battle of Poitiers in 732 as a decisive turning point, where Christian Europe rose up against a Muslim wave, and where, with just one defeat, all of Europe might have become Muslim Europe. According to that version, the Battle of Poitiers supposedly ended the Arab invasion of Europe and locked the Muslims inside Spain for centuries. But history is rarely as simple as a slogan. Were the Arabs, more precisely the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate, really trying to conquer the whole of Europe? Or were they carrying out a large-scale raid and power push into Gaul? Did the Battle of Poitiers truly shut the doors of Europe to Islam? Or were there still many later conflicts and occupations in southern France, around the Mediterranean, in Sicily, the Balkans? And does the phrase, locking the Muslims in Spain, really reflect historical reality when Al-Andalus, Islamic Iberia, for many centuries after 732, remained a brilliant center of civilization in science, art, and architecture? In this video, we won't just retell Poitiers as a simple military clash. We'll also ask some tougher questions. What was the real context before the battle? What were the Umayyads actually aiming for when they entered Gaul? What did Charles Martel do to become that northern wall of resistance? After 732, how did the Christian and Muslim worlds in Western Europe change? And is it really true that everything was stopped at Spain? And most importantly, does the image of the battle that saved Europe from Islam reflect what people in 732 actually thought? Or is it a later narrative built up for political and ideological reasons? If until now you've only heard about Poitiers 732 through extreme one-line summaries like "it saved Europe," then by looking more closely, you may find the historical picture much more complex, surprising, and a lot less cliché. In the next part, we'll go back to the world before Poitiers, how far the Arabs had come from the deserts of Arabia to the heart of Western Europe, and why the Franks ended up being the ones who had to stand in their way there. To understand why there was a battle near Poitiers in 732, we have to step back a few decades and zoom the map out much wider. In only about a century after Islam emerged on the Arabian Peninsula, the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate expanded at breathtaking speed. From the Arabian Peninsula, they seized Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, then pushed further into North Africa, then crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swept into the Iberian Peninsula, what is now known as Spain and Portugal. In 711, an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad defeated the local Visigothic kingdom. Within a short time, most of the Iberian Peninsula fell into Umayyad hands, becoming the region later known as Al-Andalus. From the viewpoint of the Umayyad leadership, on the other side of the Pyrenees lay yet another land, Gaul, with wealthy cities, monasteries, treasuries, and fertile estates. For many commanders and warriors, it looked like a promised land of plunder. In the 720s, Muslim forces crossed the Pyrenees, captured several towns in southern Gaul, such as Narbonne, and launched deeper wading expeditions into the interior. These campaigns were partly about extending influence and partly about large-scale raids for loot, a very common way of waging war at the time. What about the other side of the frontier? The land we now call France was not yet a unified France, but a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities within what we call the Frankish realm. On paper, a Merovingian king ruled, but real power at court had long been in the hands of an office that sounded secondary but was extremely powerful, the mayor of the palace. In the north, the man holding that office at this time was Charles Martel. He was not a king, but he commanded the army, managed royal lands, and gradually became the most powerful figure in the Frankish world. In the southwest, there was another power center, the Duchy of Aquitaine, relatively independent, with its own lord and its own army. When the Umayyad forces poured across the Pyrenees, they first clashed with Aquitaine, not yet with Charles Martel. In some battles, such as the Battle of Toulouse, local forces had already managed to drive the Muslim armies back. But in the long run, Aquitaine was squeezed from two directions, from the south by the Umayyads, and from the north by the Franks of Charles Martel. In that context, an Umayyad campaign deep into Gaul in 732 was not simply Islam attacking Christianity. It was also tied up with the complex relationships between local lords and knights competing for power in the Frankish world. When the Umayyad army pushed further north, raiding wealthy cities and monasteries, moving beyond Aquitaine and threatening Charles Martel's own sphere of influence, the hammer of the Franks could no longer stand aside. The Battle of Poitiers, then, did not appear out of thin air. It was the crossing point of an expanding Muslim empire, a divided Western Europe, and a military political leader eager to assert his authority, Charles Martel. In the next part, we'll dive into the Battle of 732 itself, how the two sides met, why the Franks won, and what that victory really meant when seen through 8th century eyes rather than through the slogans of later centuries. After understanding why the two sides collided in central Gaul, it's time to zoom in on the Battle of 732 itself, the Battle of Poitiers, also known as the Battle of Tours. 1. Two armies face off. On the Umayyad side, this was a mixed force, but its backbone was cavalry, mounted warriors, highly effective in fast raids, strike, withdraw, plunder, then scatter. They were used to mobile warfare in North Africa, Iberia, and southern Gaul. Speed, surprise, hitting wealthy cities and poorly defended monasteries. On Charles Martel's side, the Frankish army at this time was not yet the fully armored knightly force we imagined from later centuries, but rather heavy infantry, raised from warrior classes and armed peasants. Their strength was not speed, but the ability to hold formation and stand firm in dense blocks, resisting repeated cavalry charges. 2. Charles Martel's advantage, choosing the ground and the style of battle. The sources from that era are not detailed like a modern war diary, but most of them agree on one crucial point. Charles Martel chose the terrain to his advantage. He did not recklessly march his army onto open, flat ground to race against Umayyad cavalry. Instead, he picked a defensive position with uneven wooded terrain, where cavalry could not fully unleash their strength. The Franks were drawn up in dense infantry formations, like a human wall, holding higher ground and waiting for the Muslim forces to attack. For several days before the clash, the two sides faced off against each other, watching tensely, probing one another. It was already around autumn and the weather was cold. Time was on Charles Martel's side. With each passing day, the Umayyad army, far from home on unfamiliar land, found it harder to maintain supplies and morale. 3. The battle erupts. Eventually, the Umayyad army chose to attack. Their cavalry launched repeated charges against the Frankish infantry lines, hoping to break through the thick wall of shields and spears. But the Franks had been prepared to do one simple thing: hold their ground. No pursuing, no stretching out their lines. They stayed in position, forcing the cavalry to charge uphill and crash into solid infantry blocks like riders slamming into a wall. In that situation, the usual advantages of Umayyad cavalry, speed and flexibility, were greatly reduced. They could not easily carry out flanking maneuvers, nor fully exploit their shock tactics. In the middle of the fierce fighting, another factor appears in many medieval accounts. A Frankish detachment reportedly swung around and attacked the Umayyad camp. Rumors spread quickly through the Umayyad ranks that their camp and hard-won plunder were being looted. For an army that had marched far from home and lived largely off what it could seize, that kind of news was a heavy blow to morale. The Umayyad formation began to unravel. Some units turned back to protect the camp, and the coordination of the whole army broke down. In the chaos, their commander Abdel Rahman was killed. An army fighting on foreign soil, far from its base, that suddenly loses its main commander in the middle of battle will find it very hard to hold together. When night fell, both sides broke off the fighting. Charles Martel kept his defensive position, choosing not to risk a pursuit in the dark. The next morning, as the Franks prepared for another day of battle, they discovered something unexpected. The Umayyad camp was almost deserted. The enemy had withdrawn during the night, abandoning part of their plunder, accepting Poitiers as a defeat, and heading back south. 4. Why did the Franks win? Summed up in a few key points, Charles Martel's victory came from smart use of terrain. He refused to fight a cavalry battle against an enemy with superior cavalry, and instead forced them to attack a solid infantry line on favorable ground. The Franks stood firm against multiple charges without being stretched out or broken. They exploited psychological weakness. The attack on the Umayyad camp, whatever its exact size, hit an army that depended heavily on plunder, right where it hurt: the fear of losing everything. The death of Abdel Rahman, losing their main commander mid-battle, further shattered Umayyad morale and organization. The result was that an Umayyad force that had been fighting, plundering, and marching far from its base chose to retreat, leaving Charles Martel with a reputation as the man who stopped them at Poitiers. However, we should note one thing clearly. In the year 732, no one stood on that battlefield and declared, "Today we have saved all of Europe from Islam." For the people involved, this was a major battle, important for the Franks and for Gaul. But the idea of saving Europe is a meaning that was attached to it many centuries later. In the next part, we'll look at what happened after Poitiers. Did Muslim forces really get locked inside Spain, as many say? Or is the historical picture far more complicated than that? After the Battle of Poitiers in 732, the Franks won, and the Umayyad army retreated south. But to say that from that point on, the Muslims were locked inside Spain is a bit too simple. After 732, Muslim forces did not instantly vanish from Gaul. They still held several strongholds in the south, especially around Narbonne. Raids and plundering along the Mediterranean coast and in the Provence region continued for several decades. Only gradually, through many military campaigns and political moves, did the Franks manage to push Muslim influence back to the other side of the Pyrenees. In other words, Poitiers was not an on-off switch. You don't just win one battle and it's over. It was an important milestone in a much longer process through which the Franks consolidated their power in Western Europe and slowly rolled back Umayyad influence in southern Gaul. When we say the Muslims were locked up in Spain, that phrase suggests a group shut in a corner, unable to do anything else. In reality, Al-Andalus, Islamic Iberia, for many centuries after 732, was a major center of civilization.
Read the passage on
Cities like Cordoba were once
Yes,
among the
Ustad.
largest, richest,
your
and most
Lord
advanced in
inspired
Europe.
the bee.
There were schools, libraries, baths, and water systems. It was a place of interaction between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, with major achievements in mathematics, medicine, philosophy, architecture, music, and more. While in the north, Christian kingdoms were slowly growing stronger and beginning the Reconquista, the gradual reconquest of territory from Muslim states. In the south, Al-Andalus still saw periods of intense cultural and intellectual brilliance. So saying locked inside is a victory-defeat style of storytelling, not an accurate reflection of a far more complex and multi-layered historical reality. Poitiers did not end all clashes between the Christian and Muslim worlds in Europe. In Western Europe, conflict continued for centuries in the form of the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula. In the Mediterranean, Muslim and Christian fleets kept fighting, raiding, and struggling for control of islands and coastlines. Elsewhere, such as Sicily and the Balkans, new waves of expansion appeared later from other Muslim powers, like Arab forces in the Mediterranean or the Ottomans in Eastern Europe. In other words, Poitiers blocked one particular direction of Umayyad expansion north into Gaul, but it did not slam shut all of Europe's doors to the Muslim world. Encounters and clashes between Christianity and Islam continued for many centuries on many different fronts. Seen this way, the Battle of Poitiers was not a moment where one side saved Europe and the other side was shut in a corner. It was an important chapter in a much longer story in which both sides continued to fight, to interact, and to influence one another throughout the medieval period. In the final part, we'll talk about the myths surrounding Poitiers, why later generations like to portray it as the battle that saved Europe from Islam, and why simplifying history in that way can be dangerous for how we understand the world today. By this point, you might be asking, if things are really this complicated, then why do so many books, videos, and speeches still say that Poitiers 732 was the battle that saved Europe from Islam? The answer lies in this. History is not only retold, it is also repackaged to suit the needs of each era. Many centuries after Poitiers, especially from the early modern period onwards, as Europe began to look back on its past and search for symbols of defending Western civilization, the Battle of Poitiers suddenly became almost too convenient to frame like this. This was the day Christianity triumphed, Islam was stopped, and Europe was saved. In this version of the story, Charles Martel becomes the lone hero standing against a Muslim wave, one swing of his hammer saving an entire continent. But as we've seen, at that time, Europe was not a unified bloc. The Umayyads' goal was not necessarily Islamizing all of Europe. And after Poitiers, there were still countless conflicts and exchanges between Christians and Muslims. Even so, the simple narrative of a wall against Islam is very easy to remember and very easy to use as a slogan. And for that reason, it survives. When we move into the early modern and modern periods, as people begin talking more about Western civilization and Europe's Christian identity, Poitiers is often brought up by writers and speakers as proof that Christianity and Islam are two totally opposed blocks. Europe was almost swallowed up, and history was saved thanks to a few key battles. This way of telling the story has a big problem. It turns history, which is inherently complex, into a simple we good, they bad tale, and erases entire layers of reality, such as the brilliant civilization of Al-Andalus, the long history of cultural, commercial, and scientific exchange between Christians and Muslims throughout the Middle Ages. Worse still, in the 19th and 20th centuries, and even today, some extremist groups, on both sides, have used Poitiers as a symbol to divide people. On one side, we must do what Charles Martel did and resist today's invaders. On the other, seeing it as a symbol of the West's eternal hatred of Islam. In both cases, the Battle of 732 is no longer a historical event to be understood, but a logo slapped onto the present to stir up emotion. The problem is not whether Poitiers was important. Clearly, it was very important in the history of the Franks and Western Europe. The problem is that when we turn it into the battle that saved Europe from Islam, we exaggerate the meaning of one event far beyond the real context of the 8th century, wipe out other layers of history, such as the flourishing of Al-Andalus or the intellectual exchanges between Christians and Muslims throughout the Middle Ages, and, most importantly, turn history into a tool for dividing today's world into us and them. History, when used like that, no longer helps us understand who we are. It only helps reinforce the prejudices we already hold. A more balanced way to talk about Poitiers would be, it was an important Frankish victory that stopped a specific Umayyad campaign pushing north into Gaul. It helped strengthen Charles Martel's position, paving the way for the rise of the Carolingian dynasty and later Charlemagne, and it was one of many flashpoints in the long series of conflicts between Western Christendom and various Muslim powers in the Middle Ages, not a single decisive blow that determined the fate of an entire continent. Seen this way, we can respect the importance of the battle without falling into the trap of the saved Europe myth, which is so easily misused in modern debates about civilization, religion, or immigration. The story of Poitiers 732 reminds us that history is not just what happened, but also how we retell it and what we use it for. A battle can be important, but once it is turned into an absolute symbol, it is more likely to become an ideological weapon than a genuine lesson. If we truly want to understand the past, instead of asking who saved whom from whom, we might do better to ask, what choices did people and societies back then make? What were they afraid of? What did they hope for? What did they desire? And where did those choices lead them? Those are the kinds of questions that make history come alive and help us look at today's world with a little less extremism. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. As we've just seen, the Battle of Poitiers in 732 was indeed a turning point for the Franks and for Western Europe, but calling it the battle that saved all of Europe from Islam is a major oversimplification of history. If you enjoy this style of decoding battles, figures, and historical myths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming videos. What should we cover next? The Battle of Vienna, 1683? Lepanto? Or another topic where Christianity and Islam didn't just fight, but also exchanged knowledge? Comment below with the topic you're most curious about. I'll read them and start scripting for the next videos.